I was right to have my first two words of my speech. I'm verklempt. This has been a long journey. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to give a hearty thank you to everyone who is associated with sustaining the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. Many of you are here today, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you to Bert Steinberg, Lucy Brandon, and Gaby Berliner, who encouraged me to become a madricha and lead Kol Hadash from the in the San Francisco Bay Area. I went to a Yom Kippur service there, and they have people stand up and talk about how they felt being there, and I stood up and they said, "Will you be our leader? We'll send you for training." And that was the beginning. I'd like to thank my visiting teachers from the Institute. So many names, you know who you are. Also, I'd like to thank Rabbi Miriam Jairus and Rabbi Adam Shalom for their guidance at the IISHJ. As you know, as Miriam has said, she encouraged me right from the beginning. As I stood here 20 years ago, my first public speech that I can remember, when I was training to become a madricha, it was one of the weekend trainings. And she came up to me and told me how great it was and I should continue doing this. And that encouragement meant everything to me. I don't think I would be here if it hadn't been for that encouragement. And Adam, it's hard to turn my head, your patience with this slow, plodding rabbinic student is very much appreciated. I never felt any pressure to push through the program more quickly, and I greatly appreciate your patience and thoughtful comments on my papers. Thank you. Thank you. I'm bursting with gratitude. I'm grateful to my parents for raising me to be confident, and to my daughter Shauna for stimulating my search for a way for our family to affiliate with the Jewish community. I'm grateful to my son-in-law David for his love and support. I'm grateful to my son Zev and daughter-in-law Abby for allowing me to help them with their interfaith Jewish ceremony for their wedding. Brachot for Abby, Humanistic Judaism for Zev. I'm grateful to my brother Bob and sister-in-law Barb and their wonderful children, Jake, Molly, and Hannah, for their love and support. I'm grateful to my cousins Matthew and Leslie for inviting me to their wedding, where I was introduced to Humanistic Judaism. That's 1987, I believe, when Rabbi Wein officiated their wedding. I'm especially grateful to my husband Al for all his love and support. As many of you know, it's not easy living with a graduate student. And thank you, Rabbi Wein, and all of you who created the only branch of Judaism with which I can affiliate. I wrote several speeches for this evening. Don't worry, I'll only give you one. In the first one, I told the story of my grandmother, an Orthodox Jew who was unhappy with her lot, whether in Poland, in Palestine, in Chicago. My mother, a victim of the feminine mystique most of her life, with a brief respite in her last years. Myself, a boomer, activist, artist, mother, rabbinic student, and my daughter, the most evolved of all of us, a therapist, wife, parent, balanced and wise person. We've come a long way in the past 100 years, yes? But you already know this. My second speech was about finding a middle way as Jews, becoming more inclusive rather than exclusive. finding a path of behavior that makes sense, a path in the middle between halakha and extreme individualism, and developing a middle path, a new attitude toward our Jewish texts, midway between sacralization of the past and a secular choice to disregard these texts, or at the very least to place them on a hard-to-reach shelf in the library. But we already know, one, that Jewish exclusivity is objectionable. That's what SHJ is all about. Two, that social responsibility towards each other is desirable. That's why we're here in community. Three, and that Jewish text study can be inspiring, yes? Do we know that? I'm not so sure that we do know that. I know I didn't know that when I joined the Society for Humanistic Judaism. Jewish texts such as Tanakh, Midrash, and Talmud were passé and overrated, as if owned by the Orthodox, poured over by yeshiva buchers while the rest of the world spun around them. These texts were irrelevant and overly sacralized, even to the point of what seemed to me to be idolatrous. Then I began to study to become a rabbi, and oh, did my opinion change. I learned that there are ways to bring these texts alive, to not only try to understand their cultural context and original purpose, but to read them as one would read fiction or poetry, to read these texts together with others in dialogue, to make social bonds while studying together in community. Dare I say, one may even find moral guidelines, signposts for how to create community. You will even find rabbinic self-criticism spelled out in some of these texts. So let me share my enthusiasm for our texts now, in my third speech. Ultimately, I hope we can form study groups in our communities to study these texts together. This is not the time to enumerate all of the possible texts we might study together. Tonight, let me just give you one example from the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli. We'll briefly parse the text, discuss several points we can take from it, and think about how this and other Jewish texts may have relevance for us to study together in community. The story is often called the story of the oven of Achnai. How many of you already know this story? About maybe less than a quarter. Very good. For those who've heard it, you will be surprised. I'm pretty sure you'll be surprised by the interpretation I'll offer tonight. And for those who have not, I hope you enjoy hearing the story and see what value we can derive from it. The portion of the story that most people have heard goes like this. The sages are gathered together in the Beit Midrash, in the study house, and they're having a really heated discussion about whether a certain oven is pure, kosher. It's an oven built out of parts. The details about the oven are not important because it's not really about an oven, even though it says it is. As you'll see, Reb Eliezer states that the oven is pure. And it was taught that Reb Eliezer on that day gave all the possible arguments in the world that the oven was pure. But the other sages said, no, it is not pure. And so Reb Eliezer said, if I'm right, let the carob tree prove it. And the carob moved 100 cubits, and some say 400 cubits. But the sages said, no, one does not bring proof from a carob tree, and the carob went back to its place. Eliezer then said to them, if the law is as I say, let the water prove it. And the water in the aqueduct changed the direction it was flowing. And they said to him, one does not bring proof from water, and the water returned to its place. Eliezer then said, if the law is as I say, let the walls of the academy prove it. And the walls began to incline. But Rabbi Yeshua stood up and said, "No, when sages say it's the other way, they should not fall." And they stayed up. And it was taught they did not fall in honor of Rabbi Eliezer. They did not fall in honor of Rabbi Yeshua, and they did fall in honor of Rabbi Eliezer. And they're still inclining and standing to this day. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer said, "If it is I say, let it be from heaven." And a voice from heaven says, "Why do you argue with Eliezer? He's always right in these matters." Rabbi Yeshua stood up on his feet and he said, "It is not in heaven." What is? It is not in heaven? Rabbi Yermiah said, "We do not listen to a heavenly voice, since you already gave it to us at Sinai, and it is written there, incline after the majority." Reb Natan came upon Elijah and asked, what was the Holy One doing at that time? And he said to him, he laughed and smiled and said, "My sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me." This is the part of the story you've heard, yes? This is the popularly told story, and there are many popular interpretations. Here's one. What a humanist story. The rabbis are democratic, and they debate, and they decide by majority. God doesn't enter into the debate at all. It's up to human beings to decide what to do. I remember the first time I heard this story, I was amazed how modern it sounds. Not even miracles, not even examples of the supernatural can sway the rabbis, our humanist forebears. Really? You may ask. Really? If you ask really, you're on to something, because there's a lot more to this story than you've heard. A good place to start is the beginning. It turns out that the debate about the oven is not at the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story is about verbal wronging, words that are used to harm others. The Mishnah that the story is based upon is this: just as there is wrong in buying and selling, so is there wrong done by words. Thus, one must not ask another, "What is the price of this article?" if he has no intention of buying. If a man was a repentant sinner, one must not say to him, "Remember your former deeds." If he was a son of proselytes, one must not taunt him, "Remember the deeds of your ancestors," because it is written, "Thou shalt neither wrong a stranger nor oppress him." The portion we are studying here, that precedes the oven of Achnai story, goes on to expound on this Mishnah with example after example of ways that people could potentially wrong someone with words. The text goes so far as to say, "Better had a man throw himself into a fiery furnace than publicly put his neighbor to shame." Better had a man throw himself into a fiery furnace than publicly put his neighbor to shame. We'll have to keep this in mind as we go further to see what happens after the debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the other sages. So let's go back to our story. The last part of the story we heard ended with God's laughter and words, "My sons have defeated me. My sons have defeated me." You won't believe what happens next. At that time, all of the objects that Reb Eliezer had declared pure were burned, and they voted to ban him. That's excommunicate him. And then they said, "Who will go and inform him?" And Reb Akiva said, "I better go to inform him, or it could be the destruction of the whole world." So Reb Akiva dresses all in black. He covers himself with black. He takes off his shoes, and he goes before Reb Eliezer, keeping the prescribed distance for one who is banned. and Akiva's eyes were streaming with tears. Reb Eliezer said to him, "Akiva, why is this day different than other days?" Akiva tells him, "It seems to me that your colleagues are keeping separate from you." Eliezer's eyes also streamed with tears, and he took off his shoes and sat on the ground, just like a person in mourning. At that moment, a third of all of the wheat, a third of all of the olives, and half of all the barley in the entire world was destroyed. Some even say that the dough in the hands of women went bad at that moment. It was taught that the destruction was so great on that day that wherever Reb Eliezer cast his eyes went up in smoke. Meanwhile, Reb Gamliel, who was the head of the academy, was on a ship, and a wave stood up and almost drowned Reb Gamliel. And Reb Gamliel looks up and says, "Master of the universe, this must be about Reb Eliezer. We didn't do this for my honor or for the honor of my father's house, but I acted for your honor so there would not be disagreements in Israel." The sea immediately subsided. Is our story telling us that it was okay to ban Reb Eliezer for the sake of preventing disagreements in Israel? All we can say is that for now, Reb Gamliel is safe. But the story doesn't end here. We know that there have been horrible repercussions because of Reb Eliezer's humiliation at the hands of the sages. Ima Shalom, Mother Peace, is the name of Reb Eliezer's wife, and she happens to be the sister of Reb Gamliel as well. Little soap opera going on here. She knows better than anyone the repercussions of this harm done to her husband. And because she knows the power of her husband's tears, she keeps him from prostrating in prayer, because she knows something terrible will happen if he prostrates in prayer. But one day a beggar comes to the door. She answers the door and gives the beggar a loaf of bread. When her back was turned, you can guess what happened. Reb Eliezer prostrated in prayer. She turned and she saw her husband and said, "Stand up! You've killed my brother!" Just then the shofar blast was heard, and the sound announced the death of Reb Gamliel. Reb Eliezer said to his wife, "How did you know?" And Ima Shalom told him what she learned in her father's house. All the gates are locked except for the gates of verbal wronging. The mood has changed, yes? What originally sounded like an ideological advocacy of majority rule now sounds like a cruel joke. What is the story trying to tell us? We'll save this question for later. We need to go back and look at an argument in the first story about the oven. Remember when Reb Yirmiah said incline after the majority? He took this quote from Exodus 23:2, which says the exact opposite of what he says in our story. The quote really says that one should not incline to the majority to do wrong. What is happening here? Our simple story is not so simple after all. What have the writers, redactors of the Bavli done with this story, and why should we care? This weekend we ask about evolution or revolution in Jewish life. The Bavli writers and redactors took texts from Torah, plucked it out of context, left out words in order to make new points, and put them into a story about rabbinic debate. Then, over time, the story became rearranged and put into the context of a discussion of verbal wronging. The story was recontextualized to make a point that the redactors wanted to make about the limitations of coming to final determinations about anything. There are many and various interpretations of the story. And since we do not have a full week, and it would take at least a full week, full time, to discuss all of the interpretations that I even know about of this story, I'll just give you 3 points. 1, the writers and editors of rabbinic literature took liberties with written Torah to create a new literature. You could even call this revolutionary. 2, continuous debate is our tradition. Why stop now? 3, the sages who wrote and redacted the Babylonian Talmud were aware of their own shortcomings. In particular, if you read the entire chapter that includes the Averbach story, you will see a critique of the entire rabbinic project. I admire their humility. A little humility can be a good thing. Is there anything our communities could learn from this story? I would say yes. Absence of consensus is the norm for most of our groups. Fractious debates may occur, and individuals may feel personally hurt during disagreements when emotions are running high. I know I've been hurt, and I imagine all is not always rosy in your communities. I envision small groups of us reading texts together, respectfully listening and discussing the meaning of the text for us. This may be a great bonding experience, and there are messages that come through in the text if we are open to them. So now, let's go and study together.